Well, good evening, everyone. I'm always thankful for these opportunities that I have to be before you. Thankful for the patience and love you've shown me and my wife as we've entered a new chapter to our life. We plan on my wife coming out of hiding in a couple weeks, trying to keep everyone healthy as best we can. But I'm planning in March to do somewhat of a bowling event, but I don't want to announce any specifics yet, because what I find is when I announce specifics, other people come with better ideas of doing things. So over the next, the final weeks of February, I want to try to hash that out. In the beginning of March, try to have that laid out, a bowling event. And you kind of know my philosophy on that, I think, but if not, let me re-clarify that. I think Satan spends so much time trying to break up the family, so I think that, families are welcome. No one's excluded. Why would we try to break up what we try so hard to keep together? So definitely everyone's welcome, and we'll definitely do our best to make that happen. The topic this evening is obedience. And when it comes to that Bible topic, it's one that I find to be huge, and one that when we look at it and we really start to consider it, we can see it all throughout the Bible. But what is obedience? Obedience is compliance with an order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. Certainly obedience is important. And as we look at the reading that we just had in Hebrews chapter 5, it says, "He has become the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him." Certainly obedience is a topic that we should know about. It's one that we should consider and think about the implications of obedience in our life. Compliance with an order, request, or law, or submission to another's authority. Certainly obedience isn't an easy thing to accomplish in our lives, particularly when we think of where we live. The United States of America, founded on rebels, those who went against authority, founded on individuals who view themselves many times as independent. Independent individuals that set things apart and sometimes think they can stand alone. Obedience. Certainly obedience is important. In Luke chapter 11, verse 28, it says, "But he said, more than that, blessed are those who hear the word of God and obey it." In Romans chapter 5 and verse 19, it says, "For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so also by one man's obedience many were made righteous." Are you willing to obey? And what I've looked at is, as I look out in the world and I look at situations and I look at myself, what are hindrances? What are things that prevent people from obeying? Or what are challenges obeying? Or what is the test of obedience? What are your tests of obedience throughout your life? I think there are many tests. See, once we accept that God knows all things, he's omniscient, he's all-powerful, he has all these things. God's proven himself over and over again. He sent his son to die for us. Certainly he is one worthy of obedience. But yet so many times people will shade away from obeying. Well, what are reasons that people might shade away from obeying? I think number one, the first test of obedience we can find in Genesis chapter 22. Now, of course, there's many tests that we have when it comes to our obedience, but I think the first one that is so common we find in Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis chapter 2 and the verses following, we have a situation that unfolds with Abraham. And it's many times noted as in relation to Abraham's faith. And I definitely won't shy away from that, because I think obedience and faith are so closely tied together. But Abraham is asked to do something. He's asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Now the question is, do you think that Abraham understood why God asked him to sacrifice his son? Do you think he understood it? Do you think he understood all the details, everything in relation to it? When God laid that out, did Abraham understand? Or would you say that there are some things lacking in his understanding? In verses 15 through 18, after the situation unfolds, after Abraham goes through and he goes to Mount Moriah and he's about to offer his son, we remember that God holds him back and tells him to not do that thing, and we remember that situation. In verses 15 through 18, it says, "And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, Blessings I will bless you, and I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. What did Abraham do that was so special? Well, of course, there was many things that he did, but he obeyed the voice of God even when he did not fully understand. What value that is to an individual who's serving God. Because I think that is a great test of one's obedience, is that you obey even when you don't understand things fully. Of course, we can find this many places throughout the Bible. Think of Noah. Did Noah fully understand what was going on when God asked him to build the ark? Did he understand all things? Did he understand every detail? Or he said, God, you are God, and I will obey you, even though I don't understand everything? What about Joshua when he walked around the walls of Jericho? Did he understand every detail? Did that make sense? Oh God, this makes perfect sense. We'll walk around the walls of Jericho. We'll blow our trumpets and the walls will come down. That makes perfect sense. Or did he say, I'll obey you, God, even though I don't understand all things? We think of Moses and all the things that he accomplished and all the things he did for Israel through the help of God as he led in service. And all those powers that God seemed to give to a rod sometimes. Does that make sense that God would give power to a rod or give him the ability to do these things? Did he understand everything along the step of the way, or did he say, I will obey God even though I don't understand? In Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 6, I think there's some very wise words. It says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. See, when it comes to obedience, submitting yourself to an authority, particularly God, will you obey even when you don't understand everything? Because when we look at individuals who are trying to become Christians and individuals who are trying to serve God, a lot of times this will get in their way of obeying God. Is they'll say, I don't understand. I don't understand, God, why you're asking me to sacrifice my son. I don't understand, God, why you're asking me to build this ark. God, I don't understand why you're asking me to walk around these walls. God, I don't understand. And you know what it leads to? Is people will look back on these Old Testament examples and they will make no big deal of what these individuals did. They'll say, oh, it's no big deal what they did. You know, they really did have an understanding. But yet when we turn over the New Testament and it talks about being baptized, people say, I don't understand that. They try to rationalize God's plan. What would happen if Joshua tried to rationalize God's plan? He wouldn't have walked around the walls of Jericho. What would have happened if Noah would have tried to rationalize, say, God, why are you having me build this big ark? What would happen if Abraham tried to rationalize and he tried to say, you know what, God, I don't know why you're asking me to do all these things. Leave my home, be circumcised, sacrifice all these things along the way. I don't understand. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to obey. Many people are going to be held out of heaven, kept out of heaven, because they will not obey even when they don't understand all the details. I think that's one of the great tests of obedience, is that we understand these things about God. We understand he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all these things, but sometimes we have trouble saying, God, I'll leave it in your hands, and I'll trust you even though I don't understand the details. Another test, I think, comes, and we can see it in John chapter 6, verses 60 through 69. Another test when it comes to obeying God is that sometimes when God asks you to do certain things, they're hard. They're not easy. And because things are hard, what do people say? I don't want to do those hard things, so I'm not going to obey. I'm not going to submit myself. I'm not going to do such a thing because that would be hard on me and my lifestyle, what I'm doing. In John chapter 6, verses 60 through 69, the Bible says, therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a hard saying. Who can understand it? And in verses 66 through 68, it says, for the time many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. And when Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? But Simon Peter answered and said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are Christ, the Son of the living God. Sometimes God asks hard tasks. And because things are hard and they're not easy and they don't fit into the way that we thought it should be done, we say, I'm not going to obey. I'm not going to do those things, God. That's not the way I thought that you were going to ask me. Those are not the type of things I thought you would ask me to do. I didn't think you would ask me to forsake my family. I didn't think you would ask me to leave this behind. I didn't think you would ask me, God, to leave this occupation behind. God, I didn't think you would ask me to do this, that, or the other. I didn't think you would ask me that, God, because it's so hard. Another test of our obedience is, are we willing to do those hard things? See, in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, it says, be faithful unto death. Is that an easy thing to do? Be faithful unto death. Through all the hardships, all the pain, all the things that Satan throws at us, all the things that he throws into our minds to try to get us discouraged. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 10, it says, when he's talking about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, it says his disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. What are they basically saying to Jesus? Jesus, what you just laid out about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, that's hard. Who could do this? If this is such the case in this situation, then it would be better not to marry. I think another test of obedience is, are you willing to do the hard things? Number one, are you willing to obey even when you don't understand everything? Number two, are you willing to do things for God even when they're hard? And number three, are you willing to do things when they're not your will, when your pride gets in the way? I don't think it's the best example, but when I think back to Jesus, right before he goes to the cross, he says that prayer in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39. And I just like what he says, and I think it really shows a problem that many people have when it comes to obedience. It says he went a little further and fell on his face in Matthew 26 and verse 39. It says he prayed, saying, O Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. See, a lot of people, when it comes to obedience, they won't do it because they don't understand everything. Sometimes they won't do it because it's hard, and sometimes they won't do it because it's not their will. That's not what I wanted. That's not what I wanted. And sometimes people get so prideful, and they let pride fester in their lives, and they start to think that they're above the things that are being asked of them. How would I ever do such a thing? I'm above those things. And yet many people will walk away from a life obedient to God because it's not my will. It's not what I wanted, God. This is not the life I thought that you would ask of me. When it comes to obedience, I think there's many tests, there's many challenges throughout our lives. And the question is, are we going to pass those tests? See, throughout the Bible, we see people go through these, and they go through them in different aspects of their lives. When Abraham was asked to leave, did he understand all things? No, it was a test of his obedience. Do you think Abraham understood that this was going to be a hard task in which he was going to have to do? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Do you think that it was Abraham's will for him to leave at this particular point in his life? And we can go on and on and on. What about circumcision? Did Abraham understand all things about circumcision? Did he understand all things? Did he realize that circumcision was going to be hard as he was approaching 100? As he was getting up there in age, did he understand that was going to be hard? Was that his will to be circumcised? See, what we have to do is we have to sacrifice our will to the will of the Father and do those things which he asked. When you think of the dietary laws, did they understand everything about that? Did they understand that the law that what Jesus was laying forth of the things that they could eat as Jews, the things that they could eat and not eat? Did they understand all things? Did they understand that sometimes it might be hard? Was it their will to have those dietary laws? See, I think what God is after when it comes to us is a consuming obedience. An obedience and allegiance to God where we realize what he says in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. You can't serve two masters. You got to choose who you're going to serve. You got to choose who you're going to submit your life to. Are you going to submit to God or not? Are you going to submit to God when you don't understand all things? Are you going to submit to God when it's hard? Are you going to submit to God when it's not your will? Or will you not? certainly a challenge, and as we look at our own lives, we see all the challenges, but a consuming obedience. See, with God, there is no neutral ground, and everyone tries to make a neutral ground. I want to obey God here and here when I do understand, but when I don't understand, I'm not going to obey. I'm going to obey God here and here where it's easy for me, but where it's here and it's hard, I'm not going to obey. Well, God, I'm going to obey you here where you kind of are going with my will, but where it's not really my will, I'm just going to lay that aside. Will you obey God? In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 30, it says, whoever is not with me is against me. God does not leave neutral ground. You will submit to God or you will submit to yourself. You will submit to God or you will submit to the devil. Who are you going to obey throughout this life? Who are you going to submit to throughout this life? Because people are trying to make it so gray. As Jeff mentioned this morning and as Rex mentioned this morning, we're living in a world where there's no absolutes. Lost and saved? No, that couldn't be possible. Heaven and hell? No, that couldn't be possible. Satan and God? No, that couldn't be possible. Right and wrong? No, that couldn't be possible. Will you obey? And see, when we obey and we give ourselves to this thing, it starts to change our life. It says that Christ should be living in us in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. In Romans chapter 12 verses 1 and 2, it says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 5, it says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And what's interesting about these three reasons is they're all connected. When it comes to the test and challenge of obedience. When it comes to the test and challenge of obedience, all these things are connected. Because you know something that's hard. What's something that's hard? Something that you don't fully understand and something that goes against your will. You know something else? When you don't understand something, doesn't that make it hard? And sometimes it makes you not want it because it goes against your understanding. And sometimes when you don't want something, what does that make it for you? When you don't want something, it makes it hard for you. And sometimes you don't understand why someone would ask such a hard thing. Will you obey God? Or will you fall to the challenges? Will you fall to the tests throughout this life that God has laid forth? And certainly God wants us to obey. And He gives us every opportunity, He gives us every reason to obey. And certainly it's the best decision for us to obey. But a lot of times, we'll do whatever we can to get out of it. We'll say, I don't understand. I don't understand, you know what? And it's too hard, and you know what? It's not what I'd want to do anyways. And people will not submit to the will of God. A lot of people like to stop there, I think. Obedience to God. And certainly that is a good place for us to consider. But I think if we stop with obedience to God, I think we don't have a complete picture. Because when we obey God, what it does is it sets up obedience for the rest of our life. It sets up obedience for every area of our life. Where does God tell us to obey? Well, God tells us to obey the government. Doesn't He? Doesn't God tell us to obey the government? Doesn't God tell us to basically obey our employers and our masters? Doesn't God tell us to obey our parents? See, once we obey God, it sets up the obedience chain in all other areas of our life. And certainly that's a challenge. I just think of the government in general. See, there's a standard that God gives us when it comes to obedience. We have all the tests of obedience, but once you have decided to obey God, you have to remember that God is the starting point. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, I think Peter and the other apostles understood that God is the starting point when it comes to obedience. It says in Acts chapter 5 verse 29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than man. That's our standard. I obey God first, and then everything else comes second. But see, what people do is they say, I want to obey God, but I don't want to obey in all these other areas of my life. Won't work. People try to get out of that. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 19, we basically have the same idea repeated. It says, but Peter and John answered and said to them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. So the problem that people have is, well, where's the line? We're supposed to obey the government. We see it many times. Titus chapter 3 and verse 1. 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 13, 14. Mark chapter 12 verse 17. And probably one of the bigger passages, Romans chapter 13. Let's turn there. Romans chapter 13. Obedience to the government. Let every soul, in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. And those who resist will bring judgment on themselves, for the rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on those who practice evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but because of conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their due. Taxes to whom taxes are due. Customs to whom customs are due. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor. See, a lot of people are like, okay, I'll obey God. I'll do that. But then it comes to obeying the government. I don't want to do that. Well, how are you going to obey God without obeying the government? See, people are like, well, where's the line? What if the government turns bad? And I try to do a lesson on that. I think it's relevant. Where's the line? Well, the line is when the government asks me to do something that contradicts what God has told me to do. That's the line. Now, people don't like that because that has a lot of implications on it that people don't like. That means if the government asks me to do something that I don't particularly like, but it doesn't contradict the will of God, that I should do it. Why? I'm supposed to submit. I'm supposed to submit to the government. I think a good example is the speed limit. Now, I'm not a perfect person. But you know, the speed limit, a lot of people, the speed limit, not a big deal. Is the speed limit a law? Is the speed limit a law that has been laid down by the law of the land? Are you going to be subject to that law? Or are you just going to say, it doesn't matter? You're not submitting to the authorities. You're not submitting to the authorities. Does the speed limit contradict the law of God? And yet we'll make all kinds of justifications, won't we? Well, that's not my will. I don't really want to do that. Well, it's really hard to follow this law that the government has laid forth. It's really burdensome. I don't like it. Does it contradict the laws of God? But people don't like that. I think Daniel sets a good example in Daniel chapter 6. See, they try to get Daniel, don't they? In Daniel chapter 6, when you read up about the first 8 verses, it's amazing. Because when they're talking about Daniel, they're talking about Daniel in chapter 6, and they're talking about Daniel and how they're going to get Daniel. And you know what they realize? Daniel has not violated any law of the land. You know what? Daniel obeyed the speed limit on his horse or whatever. You know, Daniel did those things. There's no charge they could bring against Daniel because he submitted to the government. And he said, I'm going to follow the laws of the land. They said, we can't find anything on this guy. He follows land. And that's how we should be as Christians. Christians aren't rebels. Christians aren't people that go against the law of the land. The only time is if the government goes against what God has said. And that's when we see Daniel violate the law of the land. When does he violate the law of the land? When they say, you know how we're going to get Daniel? You know how we're going to get Daniel? They say, no charge, only concerning the law of God. That's the only way they could get him. As if they knew it was something against the law of God. That's the only way they could get Daniel. Because he obeyed everything else. The only way we can get him is if it's something in relation to the law of God. So you know what they made a rule against? Prayer. Daniel, you can't pray anymore. You know what Daniel said? I'm going to obey God. I obey God first, and then I follow his pecking order. I will obey God first, and then everything else. But see, people don't like that. Because it's hard to submit to the government, particularly when they ask us to do stupid things. And sometimes they do ask us to do stupid things. But we have to ask ourselves, does it contradict the law of God, or does it contradict the law of myself? See, people don't like that. I have to submit. I have to submit myself to the authority. I have to say I'm subject to them. I have to give myself to those. Yeah. But people don't like that story. Same thing with employment. Doesn't God teach us to be good employees? To teach us to be good servants? Certainly in Colossians chapter 3, I think it lays that out. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25, it's actually talking about slaves, I believe. I don't know how else. But in Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 25, it says, "Bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God, and whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of your inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality." He's telling slaves to obey their masters. I know some employees that have trouble in obeying their bosses. Try to skirt out of everything that we could possibly skirt out of. I'm going to get out of this, I'm going to get out of this, I'm going to get out of this. And you know why I'm going to get out of all those things? Because I don't want to do those things. That's hard. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to skirt around it and try not to submit to my boss. You know, I don't want to take out the trash. But you're not going to submit? Does taking out the trash violate a law of God? Last time I checked, it doesn't. Might break the law of yourself. You know, I don't want to do that. That would be hard to do. And I don't even understand why he's asking me to take out the trash. But will we submit? I think a good example of this we find in Genesis chapter 39 with Joseph. Joseph, I think, when we look at him, he was a good servant. You think that he asked Joseph to do some hard things on some days? You think they might even ask some things to Joseph that might have been a little annoying for him to even do? It's like, I don't want to do this. But interesting enough, in Genesis chapter 39, verse 4, it says, "So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him." He served him. He was a slave. He served him. We don't see where Joseph tries to rebel, where he tries to do anything bad. But once again, where does Joseph draw the line in his obedience? Well, when the wife came. And the wife tries to seduce him. And the wife tries to get him to do those things that he knew were wicked. And in verse 9, he says, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Where did Joseph draw the line? He drew the line with God. He said, I'll obey God, and I will serve to the best of my ability, do everything that I can, and the only way that I'm not going to submit is if they ask me to violate a law of God. See, the obedience that I think the Bible teaches, people are not necessarily a fan of most of the time. We look at obedience to parents. We look at obedience to elders. I think the Bible goes on, and we could look at all the areas of obedience. If you obey God, it's going to direct obedience through the rest of your life. It's going to act how you treat the government. It's going to affect your life on how you are on the job. It's going to affect your life on how you are in all areas of your life. See, the challenge of obedience, when we think about it, we look at obeying God in general. Well, it's hard to obey God when we don't understand all things. Maybe it's hard to obey God when we enter these situations where we have these issues where it's against our will. But you know what? The challenges, I think we miss out on. And when the challenges come, we decide to go our own way. See, it's not hard for me to obey the speed limit when it's raining. You know, it's not hard for me to obey the speed limit when I'm on time, but I tell you what, when I'm late, all of a sudden, I'll find every justification to break that, don't I? And I know it's a small thing, but I think that will you submit? And people don't like that idea, submitting. You know, it's easy to submit to your boss until they ask you to do something that's hard. It's easy to submit to your boss till they ask you to do something that you're not quite so keen on doing. And I think when we look at it, the reality of obedience is it's the life of a servant. It's the life of a servant. And the question is, are you willing to be a servant? Are you willing to obey God? Are you willing to obey in all areas that God asks you to obey? In Mark chapter 9, some of the apostles, they have an issue, and they're having a discussion in Mark chapter 9. Who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest? It says, but they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down, called the 12, and said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and the servant of all. See, when you're talking about obedience, I can't get around talking about obedience without talking about the idea of being a servant. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, it says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but for the interest of others." When I look at obedience, I start to realize how connected it is to this idea of being a servant. A servant to all is that I will serve everyone. I will submit to everyone, as long as it doesn't contradict the words of God. And certainly when we start to look at obedience and we start to get a picture of it, I think personally I realize how many times I fail in these areas. How many times do I fail in submitting to the government in appropriate ways? How many times do I fail submitting to my employer in appropriate ways? How many times do I fail in submitting to my parents in appropriate ways? But more importantly, how many times do I fail in submitting to God in appropriate ways? Do you realize that you're in the life of a servant? Do you realize that Jesus washed feet? He was the one that was most high, the one that should have been able to get out of all of that. The one who shouldn't have to put himself in an area where it looks like he's submitting to others. He never should have, but he was saying, prepare for the life of a servant. Prepare for the life of a servant. Certainly, obedience is connected to so many Christian values and ideas. Obedience is certainly connected to the idea of humility. Certainly, obedience is connected to the idea of faith. Certainly, obedience is connected to the idea of love. Certainly, obedience is connected to the idea of kindness. But when we boil it down, I will obey God. And when I obey God, that will flow into all areas of my life. I will obey God. See, I will pray. See, if the government steps in and say, no, you can't pray. Well, God told me, that's one of the things that I should do, so I'm going to pray. We think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Bow down. I will not bow down. I will obey God rather than men. And we look in Acts chapter 5 when they tell them, you're not going to preach anymore. I will preach. I will do all these things. Will you obey throughout your life? And when the tests come, when the challenges come, when challenges come into your life, because certainly they will, when God asks you to do something, will you do it even though you don't understand all the details? Will you do those things throughout your life even when they're hard? Will you submit to God's will even when, at the moment, it doesn't appear to be your own? Obedience is one of the things that I found to be one of the hardest things in my life. To obey, to submit to the authority of God. Maybe you have not obeyed God. Maybe you think that you can get out of this life without submitting to God. Well, you might be able to get out of this life without submitting to God, but he says a time will come when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Everyone will submit to God eventually. The question is will you do it on this plane of life or after it's everlastingly too late? Will you obey? Will you submit? If you're subject to the Lord's invitation this evening, we'd love you to please come, submit yourself to God. And if you have walked away from that straight and narrow path, we would want nothing more than to help you in any way that we can. Please come as we stand, as we sing.